Hi, everybody, and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode, we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10? Top 10 best repackagings. Now, I've done a worst repackaging, so I figured I'd look at the positive side of this. We're going to say, the way I'm going to break this down is basically the bigger amount of change in character, or the more drastic change, and how it affected their career, both added together. So if someone went from a low card guy to a main event guy or girl, or there was a drastic change and it made their career jump exponentially, that is what we're going to grade by. With all that being said, let's jump right in with our number 10. The Rockabilly and the Roadie turning into the New Age Outlaws, Billy Gunn and the Road Dogg Jesse James. It can be argued that the Roadie and the Road Dogg Jesse James are not that far off. However, the badass Billy Gunn and Rockabilly are way different. Rockabilly was going to be a new version of the Honky Tonk Man, even had Honky Tonk Man as a manager. And he had some success. Billy Gunn had success as part of the Smoking Guns. This change here, the fact that it made these two guys that were probably not going to last very much longer under the gimmicks become one of the most beloved and remembered tag teams of the Attitude Era, one of the highlights of the Attitude Era, one of the catalysts of that. They're predominantly involved in Degeneration X, especially after Shawn Michaels left. Even though there were signs of it because they were already working with Michaels and Helmsley before they officially joined. Again, the drasticness of it, how it propelled them both, where their careers went from there. When you see them now, they're still going off of this change, so that's why they make the list. Now our number 9. From the Tasmaniac to Taz. Tasmaniac was a gimmick definitely rooted in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. It was basically a Tasmanian savage type character, and it worked. It did its thing among Northeastern independents. Tasmaniac had a name. However, as the years started going on, we got into ECW, the NWO came around, and Tasmaniac wasn't going to work anymore. So he switched a little bit, shortened his name to Taz, went with a more aggressive, more UFC, MMA inspired wrestling wrestling gimmick. And I want to say, he's the first person I've seen. I could be totally wrong. There could be guys that did it in Japan. But he was the first wrestler that actually incorporated tapping out instead of the old raise their hands to see if they've passed out. So this was an interesting turn. It propelled Taz to being a legend of ECW, a multiple-time ECW world champion, and probably the only reason it's this low on the list is because when he went to WWE, he never really got his footing in WWE like he should have. He should have been portrayed a lot better, in my opinion. But anyway, even with that, with the way it propelled him, he's looked at as one of the ECW legends. That's why he's on the list. Now, our number 8. From Husky Harris to Bray Wyatt. Husky Harris was never going to set the world on fire. He was never going to be anything more than just a lackey or a tag team partner to another wrestler. He could have easily been, and this is no disrespect, I don't mean it in a disrespectful way, because there's a lot of wrestlers that would have killed for their careers. He could have been another Curtis Axel. He could have been another Bo Dallas, his brother. However, he flips the switch. He turns into Bray Wyatt. which is a lot. A lot of people say like the Waylon Mercy gimmick, like the movie Cape Fear. He draws a lot of inspiration from that. I see a lot of inspiration from Kevin Sullivan's Army of Darkness, from Raven, from different guys that have done this kind of a gimmick, this cult leader gimmick. And the whole time he's Bray Wyatt, he morphs that and he becomes a Fiend, which it's got its detractors and it's got its fans. Overall, though, Husky Harris would have never been a main star at WrestleMania and never won a world championship. Bray Wyatt did. And he's still looked at right now as a guy that could come in and make a change and be a top star in any company he decides to work for. Now, our number 7. We just talked about him a second ago. Going from Johnny Polo to Raven. Raven's one of my absolute favorite characters of all time. I loved everything about Raven. It made you, especially the ECW version. The Raven character challenged you as a wrestling fan. It didn't treat you like a dummy. I know there's an old acronym in wrestling, keep it simple, stupid, keep the storyline simple. And yeah, I agree for the most part you can do that. But when you get a character like Bray Wyatt, like Raven, who comes in and gives you a different flavor, it's like you ate vanilla all the way through the week and all of a sudden here's chocolate. And it totally changes what wrestling can be. And what a wrestler can be and what a wrestler can do. Raven was fantastic. He's, again, much like Taz, he's a legend in ECW. He had a great run in WCW, had another great run in TNA. His WWE run as Raven, not so much. But he had a fantastic run for a number of years in the character. Johnny Polo probably would not have been anything, especially with the way the climate changed, more than just a wrestling manager, which was what he was doing at the time. He bet on himself. He went with a character that was deeply rooted in the time and deeply different. He drew from Kevin Sullivan. I mentioned him. He drew from Jake the Snake Roberts. He drew from music. He drew from The Doors and Pearl Jam and all this stuff to make his character what it was. And it was so great. And I could go on for hours and hours about the Raven character, so I'm just going to cut it a little short here so we can give everybody else on the list a little bit of time. Now, our number 6. One of the guys I wished we would have seen Raven get a chance to really have a solid feud with. And that's Surfer Sting changing to the Crow Sting. I've gone on record and I've said that I love the Surfer Sting era of Sting. It's my favorite era of Sting. He was already a world champion in that gimmick. He was already a face of WCW. However, the wherewithal and the intelligence to see the shift in the wrestling landscape and to shift that character and to turn into a more darker, basically a live action version of the Crow, to shift to that version of Sting and to see where he went. People forget because WWE writes a narrative, then Winter writes the books. But the build-up for Starrcade 97 with Sting and Hogan, if they didn't fumble the ball there, WCW had such a great run that they could have stayed on top. They had Bret Hart coming off the Montreal Screwjob. They had a match that fans were waiting for a year and a half. I mean, they built this match for a year and a half. And fans did not get bored of it. They wanted to see it. This was, in my lifetime, this is probably one of the more highly anticipated matches that I've seen. And for people that didn't watch wrestling before that or during that time, they don't remember just how important WCW was. WCW gets goofed on, gets mocked a lot. WWE kind of downplays their importance. But there was a time in this era that WCW had WWE on the ropes, and their main draw was Sting. And it was the NWO and Sting's battle against them. So that choice, that change, and for how hot that was, that's why he makes this list. Our number 5. Fake Diesel to Kane. I could have went with Fake Diesel or Isaac Yankem or even the Christmas Creature. But I'm going with Fake Diesel on this one because it was the gimmick he had just before Kane. And I recently seen, I forget whose podcast it was on, but someone was saying that Kane basically had one last chance with the Kane character. I believe it might have been Jim Cornette's podcast that I heard it from. Don't quote me because I might be wrong, but Kane was basically the last chance. Vince McMahon did not see anything in Glenn Jacobs, and he took a character which should have been one storyline, 6-month run, and made a 15-20 year career out of it. He carried that character to places that no one could have ever expected. He made something, like I said, that should have been nothing at all. He made it very special, and he made it his own, and he made one of the most iconic big men in all of wrestling. If there was no Undertaker, the Kane character still would work. Yes, there'd be a little bit different story about it, but the way the person behind it, Kane, made that character so great. Now, coming from that, our number 4, talking about greatness and talking about people that Vince McMahon didn't necessarily see anything in, the Ringmaster turning into Stone Cold Steve Austin. Steve Austin had already had a good following and a solid career as Stunning Steve Austin and World Class in Memphis and in WCW. He's brought into the WWE, he's made into the Ringmaster, he's not allowed to talk, he's given a $1 million championship, and he's looked at as a guy that is there to be a good hand, to put on good matches. However, King of the Ring happens. The lead up to that, Steve Austin starts showing his own personality. And Stone Cold comes out. And we've seen glimpses of Stone Cold in his little stopover in ECW. Those promos he did in ECW were very much the proto Stone Cold Steve Austin character. He took the ball and he ran with it, and arguably ran further than anybody ran before him. The reason why it's so low on this list is because I think Stunning Steve was a high mid-card guy. It wasn't like we took a guy that was a curtain jerker and made him the biggest star in the history of wrestling. He was arguably one of the biggest stars in the history of wrestling, but he was already a guy that was considered an Intercontinental Champion or a U.S. Champion. And at that time, that really meant something. So it wasn't a big jump, even though he took it further than a lot of people would have, if that makes sense. Now, coming from that, our number 3. Vinny Vegas going into Diesel. Kevin Nash in WCW, his first time around, had a bunch of stuff that they tried to throw at the wall. He was a Master Blaster, he was Oz, he was Vinny Vegas. Vinny Vegas had a lot of the Diesel earmarkings, especially the early version of Diesel. However, it was wrapped in a My Cousin Vinny character that they played on TV. Comes to Nash decides to go to the WWE, becomes Shawn Michaels' bodyguard, is rechristened Diesel, instantly becomes a star, gains a World Championship, Tag Team Championship, Intercontinental Championship in short order, and then he would go on to play himself as Kevin Nash, who would turn into the Kevin Nash character, which is basically Diesel, and create the New World Order, one of the biggest angles of all time. Going from what Vinny Vegas was, which was a guy that you only seen on WCW Saturday Main Event in the middle of the card, to being Diesel, a guy that won the World Championship in Madison Square Garden. That was a big difference. That was a big change, and that was really a highlight of Kevin Nash's career. Now going from that, our number 2. Rocky Maivia to The Rock. This one is much like the Surfer Sting character. There wasn't a huge change, but there was. The name didn't change, the guy didn't go off of screen. He just slowly morphed what was your prototypical 80s white meat baby face. Let's pump up the crowd, yeah, cheer, high color, bright colors, high energy guy, to The Rock, a cocky son of a bitch, who played off of, basically took what the Miami Hurricanes football team, where he came from, he took that swagger, he took that bravado, he took that gusto, and he made that character into The Rock, and he started an escalation and made himself, again, arguably with Stone Cold, 2 of the biggest wrestlers in the history of wrestling. He made himself that. He made himself a monstrous star just by being himself and turning up the a-hole level to 1,000. It's amazing to go back and watch the transformation, especially back in the time watching it real time, because nobody in the world would have thought early face Rocky Maivia would be a world champion, let alone the biggest movie star in all of the world, making $20-30 million a movie now. No one would ever thought that of Rocky Maivia. So for that, he made this list. Now, before we get into our number 1, we do a thing here called the best of the rest, basically things that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it. First up, Derek Bateman to EC3. Again, this was a huge transformation. Derek Bateman, there's a lot of people that like that character. It was never going to go anywhere in WWE. The wrestler goes over to TNA. He's Chris and Ethan Carter III, a nephew of Dixie Carter. Becomes one of TNA's biggest stars, and arguably one of the biggest stars in TNA history. The reason he didn't make the list, look at the list. Look at it. I love EC3. I thought the character was great, but look at the impact of EC3 versus everybody else on the list, and you'll see exactly why he didn't. Everyone else that made this list, and EC3 was too. EC3 was a world champion with TNA. But everyone else on this list was a world champion, and some of them multiple-time champions in multiple different companies. So, for that reason, he didn't make the list quite. Next up, Fire Ant to Orange Cassidy. Much like I said with Bateman, this was a massive change in character, and you could argue Fire Ant was extremely over with the Chikara crowd. However, and I love Chikara, don't get me wrong, Chikara is a niche company that only hardcore wrestling fans really ever watched. Orange Cassidy, however, is a top guy in probably, at the point of this recording, the number 2 promotion in at least North America, and maybe number 2 or 3 in the world, depending on where you rank them against New Japan. Orange Cassidy has been in main events, he's main evented pay-per-views, he's a major merchandise seller. At the time of this video, he's not yet captured a championship as Orange Cassidy, which is why he didn't make the list. But the transformation from where he was to where he is phenomenal. Now, last but not least, on our best of the rest, and I wanted to put it in here because it's very early in the transformation, but I think if we go back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we'll see that it would have been much higher on the list. And that's Chris Thatlander going from the alien gimmick to just, I guess you could say, just a regular person gimmick. I don't know what you would consider that transformation. She stopped leaning on the Andromeda Galaxy. She stopped leaning on the more goofy of her are parts of her personality and is leaning more to who she is. And it's already doing wonders. To me, Chris Thatlander, she's always been a great wrestler. I always enjoyed her work, even in the alien gimmick. But what she's doing now you have her giving promos, and she's one of the best women promos in AEW, in my opinion. And that change it isn't a drastic change, because you still have some elements. She still wears similar gear. She still will paint her face a little bit. But just that little bit of a change made her go from just somebody on the card to somebody who could be a future women's champion. The reason she made the list is for obvious reasons. We're very early into this change. But I wanted to shout it out on here because it's my favorite current change of gimmick in wrestling. Before I get into number one, let me know what you think. If I put something too high, something too low, left a change that you like more off the list, let me know down here in the comments. Smash the like button, share, subscribe if you haven't. And going from that, our number one best repackaging in wrestling, Mean Mark Callis to The Undertaker. What can you say when you have a gimmick that's considered either the greatest gimmick of all time or one of the 2 or 3 greatest gimmicks of all time? There is no doubt about it. Undertaker is an absolute legend, on par with all of the greats of all time. Hulk Hogan, Steve Austin, The Rock, Sting, Ric Flair, whoever you want to consider a great of all time, any list you want to put it on, The Undertaker's there. He's one of the best big men. He's one of the most consistent draws. He has one of the longest careers. He's Mr. WrestleMania. I mean, he's a guy. There's no other wrestler that's more tied into the lore of WrestleMania than The Undertaker. Undertaker is the Tom Brady of the WWE. He's the greatest they've ever had. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not the biggest draw they've ever had. He hasn't had the most championships. But he's the most consistent guy. He's a guy for 30 years was on top of the card, and you could count on to sell tickets just by putting his name on the card. People would see Undertaker and buy tickets for it. The guy is phenomenal, and no one else would have made this gimmick work. There is no one in the world that could have made The Undertaker what he made. Famously, the Mean Mark Callis gimmick, he was told by somebody in WCW, I believe it was Ole Anderson, that he will never sell any tickets, that he'll never be a draw. I would have to say that's probably one of the worst takes I've ever heard in wrestling, especially hindsight being 2020, knowing how high of heights The Undertaker has risen to. Absolute legend in wrestling. That's why he's the number one on the list. Again, you think I put someone too high, too low? Let me know in the comments. If you made it all the way to the end, we're going to put one on here that didn't get on the list and didn't get on the best of the rest because it's 2 different people, and I'm sticking with that. Let's put El Generico in the comments for being left off the list. I hope somebody finds him in Mexico so his friend Sami Zayn doesn't worry so much about him. I know he hasn't been heard of in about 9-10 years, so hopefully one day Sammy can meet up with his friend, with his hero El Generico again. So let's put El Generico in the comments. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this has been my top 10 best repackaging.